So, you've learned the basic rules and want to start learning how to play the game well, or maybe you just wanted some more advanced tips for playing the game. Either way, this video is for you. This video is a list of fundamental rules that you should know when playing the One Piece card game. This video's advice is split into 3 sections, one for the most beginner-focused advice, one for more intermediate-level advice, and one for more advanced rules and guides. For explaining concepts, I'll be using the example deck of Katakuri, mostly because it's very straightforward and really easy to understand. The first basic thing to know about deck building is you want to build your deck around the Dawn Curve. You should have an escalating play on each turn, going forward to maximize what you're getting each turn. For a Katakuri example, our play could look like a Searcher turn 1, a Parasparrow turn 2, a Gadatsu turn 3, a 7-drop Big Mom turn 4, and finally a 10-drop Big Mom turn 5. While the number varies from deck to deck, a majority of your playable units are going to be 3 to 5 cost, with minimal 1 to 2 drops and only about 6 to 10 high cost units for the majority of decks, depending on how late game focused your deck is, of course. This curve, of course, changes if we're going first or second. Going second, we also get to use an extra Dawn for our leader skill during some turns. But going first, we're going to have to wait a whole extra turn to play 10-drop Big Mom, and we often struggle to use leader skill. Depending on what lines are best for us, will help determine if we want to go first or second. Katakuri obviously wants to go second, however, unlike Katakuri, some decks might not have a major curve preference. For example, another deck like Gecko Moria can easily go first or second, and prefers to counterpick an opponent's options. So I recommend looking at the most meta decks, and figuring out whether or not they want to go first or second so you can have that knowledge in mind. On the topic of deck building, we also have 2Ks, cards that often have a weaker and more situational effect, but offer twice the average value for guarding attacks. Every deck has to run these cards since they counter an opponent's aggression and allow for players to protect our units. But these don't help us push forward our strategy at all, so we're going to need to run a precise optimal number of 2Ks. For most decks, this is going to mean running 10 to 12 2Ks. Our example Katakuri usually falls running 12 2Ks, choosing to abuse 2Ks with trigger effects to blend in with the strategy. 8 2Ks is the bare minimum. For most decks, having 8 2Ks is going to be a problem and lead you to situations where an opponent will just kill you, or you can't stick any units to the field. However, certain decks can get around this by recurring resources, like some black decks, or by being the problem, like Red-Purple Trafalgar Law. Going to 14 to 16 2K triggers is not really advisable for most decks. Most 2Ks just have bad effects, even at their best. So you're making your average plays much worse. A secondary option to limiting our opponent's aggression is through blockers. Blockers offer a different trade-off to 2Ks. For 2K counters, we have to trade a set number of cards from our hand to stop an attack. Blockers, however, can block an attack regardless of a unit's power, so you can stop massive attacks with relatively little investment. But blockers also come with the added caveat of being vulnerable to an opponent's interaction. Like, it won't mean anything if your 2 blockers are KO'd by a Rob Lucci. So 90% of decks will run at least 4 blockers. But some decks with strong synergies can run 8 or even 12 blockers. However, it is important to know that the usages of blockers kind of changes with their cost. This varies a lot from deck to deck, but generally it functions something like this. 1 to 2 drop blockers will die to any and all removal, so they're often not ran at all at this point in the game. There are a few exceptions though. 3 to 4 cost blockers are often vulnerable to most removal, but will come with added effects or synergy. These often get weaved into a deck's combos and synergies. Think Rebecca or Doflamingo. 5 cost or higher are vulnerable to some removal, but often form key parts of strategies or are engine pieces themselves. Think 5 cost Sabo or 7 cost Luffy. Our example deck Katakuri uses 4 of a Sanji blocker since it can be utilized with this deck's trigger synergy gimmick. It's part of the strategy. For our last lesson in basic deck building, I'm going to explain what the numbers of copies a card in your deck means. The most straightforward ratio is a simple 4 of. You're maxing out on this card because you want or even need to see it every time. For a 4 of, you need to expect to often see multiples of this card. For a Katakuri example, this means Big Moms, our triggers, and our 2Ks. 2 ofs get a bit more tricky. Typically, these are reserved for 3 things. First, these are situational or matchup dependent options. Cards you'd want to mulligan for in certain matchups or hope to see later on. One Piece is a high draw and search power game, so this can work out in some situations. The second reason is for decks with built-in consistency options. Rob Lucci and Gecko Moria are both decks that can send tons of cards to the graveyard, therefore you can get away with running 2 copies of cards like Helmeppo and Brook, since it's so likely you'll see one, either through your draws or through milling. The last reason for a 2-of is you have space to fill, and there's not really a better option. Some decks will just have room and space that needs to be filled. Our example deck of Katakuri has this with Charlotte Cracker. We have 2 open spaces after building the core, and to make the odds work out better, we want a unit that's both a Big Mom Pirate and a trigger unit, and Charlotte Cracker fits that space very well. Overall with 2-ofs, you need to be okay with not seeing them every game. Your strategy should not lose outright if you don't see a copy of the card every game. If you would, just increase the options. If it never comes up, cut it to 0. Using 3 copies of a card is the most indecisive ground. The rationale is usually as follows. You want to see a copy of the card, but you don't want to see multiples as often, or you want to make room for as many other options as possible. 3-ofs are weird, and I do discourage them for most decks that don't already have massive consistency options. 1-ofs are used for searching combos, which aren't really a thing in the One Piece game, so unless you're playing the bad Land of Wano deck with Kazuki Odin, don't really use 1-ofs, well, unless the card is limited and you literally have to. So now that we have the basics of deck building, let's go over the basics of attacking and what we want to accomplish with each attack. First, we have to understand what each number accomplishes. If we swing an even attack, our opponent must guard with a single 1k counter. If we swing a +1 attack, our opponent must guard with a 2k counter. If we swing a +2k attack, our opponent needs a 3k counter. Now this number is a special and important concept in the game that you gotta understand, since it takes an opponent a guaranteed 2 cards to guard the attack. This means if our opponent is at 1 card or less in hand, they can't guard it. If they have 3 cards or less in hand, then they really don't want to guard it, even if they could, since it would be very painful to their own game progression. You're going to want to use this to force a KO of a unit, while you still want to use lower 1k over or even swings to force cards from an opponent's hand. To ensure our 2k overs hit, it's very strong. If swinging 2k over forces a minimum of 2 cards from our opponent's hand to guard, then swinging 4k requires our opponent to guard with a minimum of 3 cards. This scales, letting us optimize our swings to ensure certain attacks go through and even win us games. In an example, if our opponent has 3 cards in hand and 1 life, we have 3 units and 10 on, we can guarantee a KO with a 9, 9, and 7 swing, well, provided no triggers. Here's some general advice for going for game. If you can, escalate the power of your attack swings. If an opponent can't guard a lower attack, you know to push for game. If an opponent can guard a lower attack, you can redirect your higher attacks to controlling board. But if you can count out a better option, go for that instead. Generally, you're going to want to take the first 1 to 2 swings an opponent will throw at you. This is because it's going to give you an extra card in hand, which translates dramatically to improved consistency, more card advantage, and more resources to guard when it really matters. In 90% of situations, you're not at risk to dying until later on, so take that early advantage. The situations in which you should guard very early are relatively rare. It's basically limited to a few niche aggro decks, something like Monkey D. Dragon or Red-Purple uses Captain Kidd, where late game, most attacks are practically unblockable, so any life padding becomes worth the potential trade-off. Then again, some of the best decks will just take the hit and use the higher resources to outplay the aggressive options. One of the most important things in the One Piece card game is board control. Having more units than your opponent is a surefire way to win every game. As such, you should look to remove an opponent's board before attacking their life. Think of it like this. Swinging into life nets them 1 card, but swinging into a unit loses them a card in hand or field. Either way, it's a win-win. It takes pressure off you and puts pressure on an opponent. Most of this game's best decks have been removal-based. Sakazuki, Trafalgar Law, and now Rob Lucci. These decks have built-in effect-based removal, but unfortunately, most decks are going to just have to swing into units. In my experience, you can remove most units by swinging 2k over them. However, to guarantee a KO, you're going to want to be at least 4k over. Remember those magic numbers. However, in most cases, realistically, you're just going to be using extra Dawn to pepper an opponent's units and keeping pressure on them. Don't overcommit and forget to develop your own board. Unfortunately, a big part of One Piece is going to be dealing with triggers, both your opponent's and your own. and this gets a lot more tricky since they're both luck-based and matchup dependent. But in general, there are some things to do and general trends for each of the colors. First things first, let's mention the most common type of trigger effect is for removing an opponent's unit. Every color has these. This means on a turn where we're going to be attacking the life, we want to attack with units first, then with leader last, and then play units and build our board after we attack. That way, if our opponent gets lucky, the damage is minimized. Now for that matchup specific knowledge. Green at worst is going to rest your units and can only KO already rested units, but they most likely won't have any triggers at all, so honestly, don't respect green deck triggers. Purple has triggers based around ramping and decreasing Dawn, but can technically do anything at the cost of minusing Dawn, so rarely respect purple triggers. Black triggers mostly focus on KOing low cost units, so know you might lose some small units when attacking in the life. Red has similar triggers to black, but these can be countered by making a unit's power higher. Blue triggers have non-KO removal for most small to mid-range units. Not only that, they also have draw power. Blue triggers can hurt through deck-specific protection, so be aware it can happen. Now yellow. Yellow is the big trigger deck. They have removal, healing, and most importantly, the ability to easily play very strong units from life. So not only do you have to play around potential removal and just stalling, you also have to understand that any aggression from you has the potential to set up your opponent even more. So to play against yellow, you need to gauge your hand in potential late game and push just enough to progress to a game win without losing from it. Basically, if you're barely surviving as is and can't win immediately, don't swing mindlessly into life. In a more specific scenario, bringing yellow to 1 life puts several powerful cards online. Same to you going to 3 or lower life. Now, you will eventually have to go to both of these thresholds, but in some cases where you think you can starve or have to avoid certain cards, you can leave them at 2 or so life. Oftentimes against yellow, it's best to play reactionary to your opponent's life, like waiting to use the turn on some removal if a triggered unit is played. If you want to choose a deck with the goal of winning competitive events, there are a few factors you're going to have to take into account. Unfortunately, not all of them are going to be casual friendly. There's a question of complexity, pricing, and consistency. Consistency is the most important item on this list because it's locked to deck choice. Certain decks and strategies will only be able to be improved so much. To win a major tournament, you need to win about 10 games in a row. If your deck bricks 1 out of every 20 games, then maybe it's likely fine, but if your deck bricks 1 out of every 5 games, you can't reasonably expect it to win an event. Since not only are you going to have to deal with being better than other players, you're going to have to take those losses automatically. In order to win, you'd have to get absurdly lucky or cheat. You should be tailoring your deck choices to what level of events you want to play at. A 1 in 5 deck isn't a good time for a regionals, but it's perfect for a locals. Knowing what decks are available to you, consistency-wise, is very important. Yellow, for example, has Enel, which is very consistent at implementing its game plan. It's a regionals level deck. Green-Yellow Yamato is often able to just blow out opponents, but oftentimes it's also just gonna brick, or an opponent can just inherently shut it down. It's a deck much more suited to a locals level event. Our Katakuri example is more consistent than Yamato, but still not quite as consistent as Enel. It's like a locals plus level deck, or more commonly known as a rogue deck. The second factor for choosing a deck for competitive is knowing the expected level of complexity. If you're choosing a more complex deck, you're going to need to practice and learn it more to be successful. Don't pick a difficult deck like Red-Green Trafalgar Law if you're not going to put in the work or don't have the time. A second factor is that difficult and complex decks will wear you out faster at long events. While you're stressing out over the best choice of 5 searches, what card to revive from grave, and how to manage your Dawn, that Katakuri player has already opened his second glue bottle and has played Big Mom. The point is, make sure you're prepared for a more challenging time if you're choosing a more complex deck. Lastly, don't overspend yourself on getting the best deck. It sucks to hear, but if you can't afford a $400 deck, don't buy a $400 deck. Sometimes you're just going to have to play a budget option instead. My advice is to look ahead at what's going to be expensive and plan ahead both with your budgeting and in picking up cards for cheaper today than what you would later on. So, let's talk about one of the most important skills in a competitive game. That's reading an opponent. While we can't ever fully know what's in their hand, we should be able to get very close. Typically, this can be found out by 2 things: how an opponent guards an attack, and by what play they make. But do understand everything in this section changes dramatically based on each specific deck. So as you learn, you'll want to apply specific deck knowledge to these general rules. Getting knowledge from how an opponent guards is easier, so let's start with that. If an opponent is taking damage unnecessarily and is not at the risk of dying this turn, it usually means they're looking for more resources. If they are at risk of losing this turn, and they're still taking the damage anyway, it likely means they don't have guard. And what I mean here is by taking a 5k or 6k swing, when they have 3 to 4 cards in hand. For larger hands, what they're telling you gets a bit more up in the air. They could be doing either the first two options, but they could also be baiting you to overextend or to not focus on removal or developing your board. For example, it's common for a red deck to leave up a Rad Beam, but then you can check if they have a Dawn to make that guess. If your opponent is overguarding using a 2k counter instead of a 1k, it means they don't have any 1k counters they can throw away, either 1ks they want to play and not guard with, or just from not having any 1ks. Depending on the size of the hand, you should adjust the call. Of course, if they give you two 1ks instead of a 2k for a 6k swing, it means they don't have 2ks. Very important to keep note of. Now, if an opponent massively overguards, such as using a Radical Beam on a 1k overswing, then they almost certainly have no counter in hand. At moments like this, you should fully capitalize on it. Now, reading a hand from what an opponent plays on their turn is a bit more rough. Fundamentally, I find that you gotta first understand that each deck has an optimal line of plays to make in any given situation. So if they're not doing that default optimal play, either you've pushed them to play differently, or they don't have the required cards in hand. For example of Katakuri, their optimal play with 10 Dawn is usually to play 10 drop Big Mom. If they don't play it and instead focus on attacking your board, it usually means they're scared of losing to aggro and can't play the Big Mom. But if they instead focus on developing small units on the board instead of the 10 drop Big Mom, it means they don't have a 10 drop or 7 drop in hand. From there, we can assume they have either 2Ks, dead units, or events in hand. And then combining this with knowledge of how they guarded, we should be able to reasonably guess what's in our opponent's hand. Of course, to reiterate, you can't be certain of what's in the opponent's hand, but you should have a guess. You gotta change your plays depending on what they're likely to have. This is why knowing common deck lists for the most popular decks is important for a competitive game. It's knowledge you want to have an advantage. Alright, there's some basic advice for how to play the One Piece card game. You can do a lot with what I've given here, but if you want to keep improving, I'd recommend playing games with people IRL and learning the specifics of whatever deck you want to play. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.